Welcome to our Cold War video on the Korean War. The Korean War is clearly labelled as a Cold War crisis in our syllabus and is a pivotal point for us to take a look at. The Korean War itself lasted from 1950 to 1953, but certainly had some long-term impacts, which is what we want to take a look at. So going back to understanding the beginnings of the Korean War, we need to understand what was happening, of course, at the end of World War II. You might recall that Korea had been occupied by Japan for quite some time before World War II, and as part of the breaking up of everything at the end of World War II, the Soviets had invaded into the north of Korea as promised against Japan, and at the Potsdam Conference in 1945 it had been agreed between America, Britain and the Soviet Union that Korea should be a new independent country at the end of the war. That's not quite how it worked out. At the end of World War II, of course, the Soviets declared war on Japan, and in that Soviet-Japanese war, which lasts for a very short time really, the Soviets do go down, invade the north of China, but also come into the north of Korea. From the south, we have the Americans landing in the south of Korea. And what ends up happening, a little bit like what had happened in Germany, they kind of agree to partition Korea between themselves. It's not a formal agreement, rather just one of those things that make sense at the time. And really they draw a line at what we call the 38th parallel, with the Soviets occupying the north and the US occupying the south. Now, unfortunately for Korea, that had not been the intention to actually to deliberately separate Korea, but this is what happens. And as you can imagine, the Red Army in the north weren't going to budge, and the US in the south were not going to give over the south of Korea to the communists either. In 1946, effectively the border between North and South Korea becomes closed. It becomes illegal to cross that border without any permission. And what happens then is that we have two separate governments really being set up. In the north, we see a guy called Kim Il-sung thrust into the leadership. Kim Il-sung, of course, was a good communist who'd been training in China, and he was established as the new leader of the Communist Party in North Korea and given a lot of advice from his Stalinist advisors. And really what we see established in North Korea is a Stalinist state. And it's very interesting, if you continue to watch North Korea today, you will see a lot of the same kind of features that we see from the Stalinist state still in North Korea today. And of course Kim Il-sung's grandson is the current leader of North Korea. In the south, the UN supported going ahead with elections, and in 1948 the people of South Korea elected a guy called Syngman Rhee, who was an anti-communist, and he becomes the new leader of a brand new country, which they call themselves the Republic of Korea. And in the north they said, well, if you're going to be a country, so are we, and so they call themselves the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And this is where we see this establishment by 1948 of separate countries, North and South Korea. North Korea also get themselves a nice strong army pretty quickly, and by 1948 both the US and the Soviet troops go home and leave the Koreans to it. What happens then is that North Korea in June 1950 launch an all-out assault on the South Korea, so they attack. At this point the US gets Douglas MacArthur, this guy here, who had been a hero general of World War II. He was stationed in Japan at the time, overseeing the reconstruction of Japan, and very quickly he sends in troops and supplies to South Korea to try to resist this spread of communism. The United Nations is not happy either, and the United Nations Security Council within a few days votes to actually send in a UN military force to support the South Koreans. Now, one of the things you might say is, how can they do that? Why didn't the Soviets block it? Well, the Soviets were not at the meeting. The Soviets were refusing to attend Security Council meetings of the United Nations at this stage because China the Chinese representatives were from the nationalist government, not from the new Maoist communist government, and so the Soviets were refusing to attend in protest. So this is why the United Nations gets approval for a United Nations force to go in and support South Korea. And this is where we end up with this, it's originally a civil war, but this is really a Cold War conflict and it becomes very heated very quickly. Now you might ask, did Kim Il-sung act by himself, or was this Stalin's plan? Here he is having dinner with Kim Il-sung. It's not clear if this was Stalin's plan. Certainly some historians have suggested that Stalin wanted to actually embroil the United Nations and the United States in a conflict in Asia to take some of the heat off what was happening over in Germany and Eastern Europe in particular. And certainly it was suggested that if the Chinese went in to fight, this would be great for Stalin. It would weaken China and the West without any particular effort from him. We don't know for sure if it was Stalin's plan, but certainly Kim Il-sung would not have attacked without Stalin's say-so to go ahead. And so we know that there was some support from Stalin coming in. That's not to say that there's a lot of physical support, as we'll see in just a moment. So, in June 1950, the North Korean army attacks the south, and as you can see here, the red represents the spread of the North Korean army, and within a few months it had pushed the United Nations, the South Koreans and the quick United Nations forces down to a very small corner of Korea, and things were not looking good. This is when the United Nations forces come in much larger numbers. They attack from the sea, and within a few months they are able to push back the North Koreans all the way to the Chinese border up here. And it's in October 1950, as the UN troops are getting very close to the Chinese border, that the Chinese enter into the war. Officially, this is not the Chinese army. They are called volunteers. Mao is trying to make sure that the Chinese are not taking too much responsibility for the war. But in the end, it is through the involvement of Chinese troops that we see a massive pushback. And by November 1950, you see how quickly this war is moving. By November 1950, the Chinese-supported North Korean troops are able to push the UN forces back, and they're sitting almost around that 38th parallel where everything started. Soviet troops are involved as airmen. They are flying disguised as Chinese, but the Soviet airmen are involved in the war. But really, the Soviet involvement is quite limited. And in fact, Stalin even stops getting involved from 1951 onwards, when it becomes clear that the North Koreans are not going to win, nothing is happening. He kind of pulls back on his support for what is happening in Korea. Things do get so hot in Korea that this guy, Douglas MacArthur, who is leading up the United Nations force at the time, he actually asks, he's thinking that things are so difficult that he wants to bomb China, and he has also asked for the possibility of using nuclear weapons in the war. Now, thankfully, by this stage, President Truman, you might remember he was a bit gung-ho when he first became the president back in 1945, but now a little bit more war-weary, perhaps, a little bit more understanding of the difficulties of international relations, he is not happy with this idea that we might be heading towards a nuclear war and getting the Chinese so involved. In fact, he sacks MacArthur. So much does he dislike the idea of escalating the war. Truman himself no longer is president after 1952. We have a new president, President Eisenhower. He's elected in late 1952 and starts his presidency in 1953. We'll take a closer look at Eisenhower and how he gets to be president later on. But he does come in and he is a bit more gung-ho, and he is wanting to end the war in Korea. In fact, he threatens to use nuclear weapons on the Chinese if they don't come to the negotiating table. So desperate is he to try to stop the war and get US troops out. We've already said that Stalin had kind of lost interest, and the whole war just loses interest for the Soviets, particularly after Stalin dies himself in March 1953. A few months later, war-weary, both sides agree to an armistice. So the Chinese, the Americans, and both sides, the Korean sides, agree to an armistice, which is signed in July 1953, and effectively splits Korea along that 38th parallel where the war had begun. To this day, we still do not have a peace treaty between North and South Korea, and there continues to be a demilitarized zone between the two nations. So that's the war itself, but in terms of how does it impact on the development of the Cold War, what can we draw from it? Well, the Americans are saying NSC 68 was right. We need to look after not only what's happening in Europe, but we also need to invest in Asia. And this is the beginning of a huge investment in Southeast Asia. The American money starts pouring into Indochina, where the French are fighting against the Vietnamese communists. And also an agreement is made. Mao agrees to leave the nationalist Chinese at Taiwan alone, and the US provides a lot of financial support to keep them going. NSC 68, as I've already said, has proved to be right. It's adopted, it's implemented, and US military spending and build-up is justified, and our arms race goes ahead at full pace. US foreign policy is now globalized and militarized, and this is how it's going to stay for the rest of the Cold War. We get a peace treaty between Japan and the US, also concluded in the background here, but what that allows is US military bases in the Pacific. The US is not willing to leave the Pacific region now, and they stay in the region to keep an eye on what's happening with China and with the Soviet Union. China itself, of course, has proven itself to be a fairly strong army, even so early in its history. And it's certainly seen as a threat. Our arms race continues behind the scenes. Both the US and the Soviet Union not only have an atomic bomb now, but by the end of the Korean War they both have the hydrogen bomb, which is even more destructive. The interesting thing to note about the Korean War, however, is that despite the escalation of what was going on in Asia, Europe actually did remain the focal point. And they have limits to how much they're willing to invest in the Cold War in Asia. Both the Soviet Union and the US did fight in Asia. They both want to show that they're committed to their ideology. But in the end, Europe remains their focus, and they want to continue to defend their ideologies in Europe as well as in Asia. So we see some restraint shown in the Asian field. So that wraps up our overview of the Korean War crisis and how it has an impact on our continuing development of the Cold War.